Number 10. The Schöningen Spears. In 1994, archaeologists excavating an open-cast coal mine near Schöningen in Lower Saxony, Germany, pulled 8 objects from the sediment that immediately stopped the excavation. The objects were wooden spears, complete, intact. Preserved in waterlogged soil for approximately 300,000 years, that number is not a typo, 300,000 years. The spears averaged around 2 meters in length. They had been carved from the trunks of young spruce trees. The tip of each spear was the hardest part of the wood, the base of the trunk, deliberately selected because a hunter who understood wood grain and density had made that choice. The balance point of each spear sat roughly 1/3 from the front, identical to the design principle used in modern javelins. These were not sharpened sticks. These were precision hunting weapons designed by someone who understood ballistics before the word existed. For decades, the dominant assumption was that human beings 300,000 years ago were barely functional, opportunistic scavengers. Simple, reactive. The Schöningen Spears demolished that assumption in a single afternoon of fieldwork. Whoever made these had planned a hunt at distance. They had chosen the right trees, shaped the shafts, tested the weight, and committed to a strategy that required the prey to be alive and moving when the weapon was thrown. This was not reactive behaviour, it was premeditated engineering. The site also yielded horse bones bearing cut marks consistent with systematic butchering. The hunters had not stumbled onto a carcass. They had hunted, killed, and processed large game with tools sophisticated enough that their design principles remain in use today. The archaeologists called it an ancient sporting goods store. The implications were worse than that. Number 9. The Blombos Cave Workshop. In 2008, a research team led by Christopher Henshelwood of the University of Bergen published findings from Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa. They had recovered 2 abalone shells dating to approximately 100,000 years ago. The shells were not empty. They contained the preserved residue of a compound that someone had deliberately manufactured. The recipe was this: ochre ground to a fine powder, combined with crushed bone, charcoal and animal fat, then mixed together using a bone spatula that still showed trace marks of the process. This was not paint. This was the oldest known manufactured substance in human history. Whoever made it had understood that different ingredients combined produced different results. They had sourced materials from multiple locations. They had processed each component separately before combining them. They had stored the finished compound in a container for later use. This is not survival behaviour. Grinding ochre does not feed you. Mixing it with bone and fat produces nothing your body needs. But it produces something your mind needs, or something your culture needs, or something your ritual requires. 100,000 years ago, a human being in a South African cave was following a recipe. The implications are not comfortable. If recipe thinking existed that early, then everything we assumed about the emergence of symbolic cognition, planning and cultural transmission is wrong by tens of thousands of years. The compound itself has never been definitively explained. Body paint, hide treatment, adhesive, ritualistic material. The best answer is probably all of those, used by people whose cognitive lives were already far more complex than the old textbook models allowed. Number 8. The Maras cord. In 2020, researchers analysing material from Abri du Maras, a rock shelter in the Arger region of France, published a finding so small it almost wasn't noticed. A fragment of cord. 3 twisted plant fibres, approximately 6 millimeters in length, adhering to a stone tool, dated to between 41,000 and 52,000 years ago, and attributed not to modern humans, to Neanderthals. The significance is not the object. The significance is the technique. Making cord requires what cognitive scientists call hierarchical thinking. You take small fibres and twist them in one direction to form strands. Then you take multiple strands and twist them in the opposite direction to create rope. The mathematics of the process automatically cancel out, producing a stable structure stronger than any individual component. This is the same thinking required to construct a sentence. Subject, then predicate, then subordinate clause, each layer adding meaning and a structure that cannot be assembled randomly. Neanderthals were doing this. In a rock shelter in France, 50,000 years ago, a being we had classified as cognitively inferior to modern humans was twisting plant fibers into cord. Not because instinct told it to, because it understood that small things combined correctly become strong things. There are almost no other examples of Neanderthal cord, because plant fibers rot. What survived at Maras survived by accident, adhering to stone in conditions unusual enough to prevent decomposition. The cord existed everywhere. We just cannot find it. Number 7. The Sulawesi hunting scene. In 2019, a team led by Maxime Orbit of Griffith University in Australia announced uranium series dating results from a cave painting in Liang Bulu Sepong 4 on the island of Sulawesi in Indonesia. The painting is at least 43,900 years old. It shows human-like figures with animal features, what archaeologists call therianthropes, pursuing animals with hunting weapons. Multiple figures. Multiple animals. A narrative. For decades, Europe held the title of birthplace of figurative art and narrative painting. The caves of Lascaux and Altamira were the icons. Then Sulawesi rewrote the timeline and the geography simultaneously. This is not older European art found in Asia. This is older than the oldest known European cave art, found in a completely different part of the world, suggesting that representational narrative painting was not a European invention that spread outward. It was a human capacity that appeared wherever humans were. The hunting scene is particularly significant because it is not simply an image of an animal. It is a story. Something happened. Figures with spears approached creatures. The scene unfolds across the cave wall in a sequence that implies time, action, and consequence. 43,900 years ago, in a cave in Indonesia, a human being painted a story, and then covered it in darkness, and walked away. Number 6. The Hohle Fels flute. In 2008, Nicholas Conard of the University of Tübingen announced the recovery of a near-complete flute from Hohle Fels cave in the Swabian Jura region of Germany. The flute was made from the radius bone of a griffon vulture. It was approximately 22 centimeters long. It had 5 finger holes, carefully spaced, cut with precision. The mouthpiece showed specific modification designed to direct airflow across the opening. It is at least 40,000 years old. When researchers reconstructed the instrument and played it, it produced a clear, controlled, tunable sound across multiple notes. This was not an accident. Someone had understood enough about acoustic physics to design an instrument capable of producing controlled melodic variation. They had selected the right bone for its hollow structure. They had placed the finger holes at intervals that produce a usable scale. They had created a mouthpiece that converts breath into directed vibration. 40,000 years ago, a human being who had never heard of music theory built an instrument that worked. The more disturbing implication is what it means for everything that instrument represented. Music requires an audience. An audience implies a social context. A social context implies shared experience, shared meaning, shared emotional response. Ice Age humans gathered somewhere, in the dark or around fire, and played music to each other. The notes are gone, the bone remains, and that is enough to know the nights existed. Number 5. The Sungir burials. In 1955, workers digging clay near the Russian city of Vladimir, 200 kilometers east of Moscow, broke into something unexpected. Soviet archaeologists arrived and began excavations that would continue for decades. In 1969, they found the children. 2 individuals buried head-to-head in a single grave, dating to approximately 34,000 years ago. One was male, approximately 12 or 13 years old. One was female, approximately 9 or 10. Around them were 10,000 individually carved mammoth ivory beads. Each bead required approximately 1 hour of skilled labour to produce. The researchers calculated that the grave goods represented more than 10,000 hours of human effort, invested in the burial of 2 children. The female skeleton showed evidence of a severe developmental disorder affecting her femurs. Her legs were significantly bowed in a manner that would have made walking difficult and running effectively impossible. She could not have hunted. She could not have gathered effectively. She could not have kept pace with a mobile hunter-gatherer group in the conventional sense. She was buried with 10,000 hours of her community's labour. The only framework that explains this is one in which the value assigned to individuals was not calculated by their material contribution. 34,000 years ago, a prehistoric community decided that this child, who could barely walk, was worth more resources in death than most modern funerals cost. Whatever that community believed about personhood, about value, about what a life was worth, it was not primitive. It was more generous than most of the systems that came after it. Number 4. The Bruniquel cave structures. In 2016, a team led by Jacques Joubert of the University of Bordeaux published findings in Nature that changed the timeline for complex Neanderthal behaviour permanently. Deep inside Bruniquel Cave in southwestern France, researchers had been investigating circular structures made from broken stalagmites. The structures were not near the entrance. They were 336 metres inside the cave, far beyond the reach of any natural light. Uranium-thorium dating of the stalagmite stumps gave an age of approximately 176,500 years. The structures were made by Neanderthals. To build them, the builders had to carry fire 336 metres into complete darkness. They had to break the stalagmites systematically, transport the pieces, and arrange them into rings. The fire scorching visible on some of the stalagmites confirms controlled flame was used throughout the construction process. This was not accidental. This was a deliberate project conducted in complete darkness, deep underground, requiring sustained cooperation, planning, and repeated trips. We do not know what the structures were for. That is the most disturbing part. We can explain tools, we can explain weapons, we can explain fire, but structures built in absolute darkness 336 metres underground 176,500 years ago serve no obvious survival purpose. They were built for reasons that made sense to the beings who built them. And those reasons are gone. All that remains are the rings of broken stone in the dark. Number 3. The Borneo amputation. In 2022, a team led by Tim Maloney of Griffith University published findings from Liang Tibo Cave in the East Kalimantan province of Borneo. The skeleton of a young person lay in a burial dated to approximately 31,000 years ago. The left leg ended below the knee. Not from trauma, not from predator damage. The bone showed evidence of deliberate surgical amputation. The cut was clean. The edges of the bone showed post-surgical remodelling consistent with years of survival after the procedure. The individual had lived for an estimated 6 to 9 years with the missing limb. This is the oldest known surgical amputation in the human record. It predates the previous oldest known example by more than 24,000 years. To perform this surgery, someone 31,000 years ago had to understand enough anatomy to cut through muscle and bone while avoiding fatal blood loss. They had to manage the wound afterward in conditions without antibiotics, without sterile tools, without modern pain management. The patient survived. Then the community kept them alive for years. A person who could not run, who required regular care, who represented a resource cost rather than a resource contribution, was kept alive and eventually buried with evidence of deliberate placement. Prehistoric medicine was not guesswork, and prehistoric communities were not indifferent to those who could not contribute. Both of those assumptions are wrong by 31,000 years. Number 2. The White Sands footprints. In 2021, a team led by Matthew Bennett of Bournemouth University published findings from White Sands National Park in New Mexico. Human footprints. Pressed into ancient lake sediment. Dated using radiocarbon and optically stimulated luminescence analysis to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago. The dating was confirmed. Then, confirmed again. The significance is this: 23,000 years ago falls within the last glacial maximum, the period when continental ice sheets were at their greatest extent. The accepted model of human migration into the Americas required that people cross the Bering Land Bridge and travel south through an ice-free corridor that did not open until after 16,000 years ago. The White Sands prints predate that corridor by 7,000 years. Humans were in New Mexico during the last glacial maximum. They had no ice-free corridor to pass through. The old model is wrong. Among the trackways at White Sands, researchers identified a sequence showing a large individual walking carrying something, then setting it down briefly, then picking it up again and continuing. It was a parent carrying a child. This is not a monument, not a burial, not a weapon or a tool or a symbolic object. It is a parent 23,000 years ago carrying a child across mudflat in what is now New Mexico, setting the child down for a moment, then picking them up again. The simplest human act, pressed into the ground, waiting 23,000 years for someone to find it. Number 1. The sea crossing to Sahul. The oldest known archaeological site in Australia is Majidbabi Rock Shelter in the Northern Territory. The artefacts there have been dated to at least 65,000 years ago. At that time, Australia did not exist as a separate landmass in the way we understand it today. It was part of Sahul, a combined landmass including modern Australia and New Guinea, connected by land now submerged under the Arafura Sea. But Sahul was never connected to mainland Asia. Not at 65,000 years ago, not at any point in human prehistory. Between Sunderland, the continental shelf of Southeast Asia, and Sahul lay a minimum of 90 kilometres of open ocean. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last glacial maximum, the crossing required navigating open water with no visible destination. Humans crossed it anyway, 65,000 years ago. This means that human beings tens of thousands of years before the oldest known boat, before pottery, before agriculture, before any technology we would recognise as complex, built or assembled some form of watercraft, loaded enough people onto it to establish a founding population, and pushed out into open ocean toward land they could not see from where they launched. The crossing required planning, construction, provisioning, and navigation. It required believing that there was something on the other side worth finding. The people who made that crossing are not known by name. Their boats have not survived. Their language is gone. Their stories are gone. What remains is their presence in Australia 65,000 years ago and the unambiguous implication of how they got there. We consistently underestimate what prehistoric humans were capable of. These 10 discoveries exist to correct that error. The people before history were not waiting for history to begin. They were already doing things we still find difficult to explain.